Okay, here it is, finally, the shading tutorial that people have been asking me to make for quite a long time. And to be honest, part of the reason I never made one before was because I never really felt I had my shading where I wanted it to be. Like, I wasn't that consistent in style, and to be honest, I didn't really know what I was doing. Whereas now, I kind of feel like I kind of know what I'm doing, you know? My process is a little more streamlined and I quite like the outcome, so finally I'm ready to do a video for you. Obviously this is very stylized shading. If you're looking for like how to shade realistically, this is not the video for you. It's very stylized shading for like cartoony styles, I guess. And obviously you're free to shade however you want. Just because this is how I do it doesn't mean this is the only way you should shade, obviously. This is just how I do it, and to be honest, it's very much going to be, I'm just going to step by step walk you through what I do. What you see on screen right now is the actual finished picture that I'm going to be using for this video. So that is what the outcome of my shading looks like at the moment. That's my most recent picture, so yeah, that's a good idea of what you get if you follow these steps. Okay. So the first thing you want to do once you've done the colouring, obviously, is I usually shade on top of my line art. So I group the line art and colour layers, duplicate the group, then flatten that all together, and then make a new layer on top and clip that to the like flattened layer I've just made and set the layer to multiply. I then would usually choose generally a pink colour, sometimes purple. It does depend a bit on what the background colours are and the character colours are, but generally I do use pink, to be honest. And then literally just keep it quite zoomed out and use a large brush size and just start blocking in where the shading's going. I generally leave the opacity quite dark for this, just so I can see exactly where the shading's gonna go for now. And keep it all quite messy, you don't have to be too neat at this point. Now, why do I shade on top of my line art layer? Because I know a lot of people obviously do shade under the line art, but for me, because I colour my line art, which you should really do before you start shading, and if you want to know about colouring line art, I have another video on line art which covers that. So I colour my line art, and that obviously makes it quite pale. Generally, not always, but especially if you've got a pale line art, I find it better to shade over the top, because otherwise you end up with the colour underneath the line art's going to be darker than the line art itself, which just doesn't look good. So it's better to colour line art and then shade above it so that everything looks darker where it should. Like, the line art will be darker as well in the places that are shaded, if that makes sense. So it unifies the picture better is what I'm trying to say, I think. Try and have some idea before you start shading of where you want your shading to be. Like, sometimes it can help to make a little dot or arrows or something to remind yourself the direction the light's coming from. To be honest, I don't usually do that, but it's probably a good idea if you do, to try and keep all the lighting in the same direction. Obviously, usually, to be honest, I go for a sort of ambient lighting unless I'm doing like a full scene where there's like a background and it's obvious where the light's coming from. But even then, you do kind of want to keep it so that it makes sense. Once you've filled in where you want your shading to be, I would generally then reduce the layer opacity to about 30 or 40%. Obviously it can vary, but that's usually what I use. So once you've blocked in all your shading and reduced the opacity, it's time for the tedious, often tedious, it does take quite a long time, part of going back in and neatening everything up. So usually when I'm doing like hair, at the base of like the hair tuft, I make it quite a rounded sort of shape, and then do little highlights at the edge of the shading so that, like, I very rarely have my shading actually touch the line art unless it's like a big block of shading where it's like a really dark area, like all the outside edges and stuff. I erase the edge of the shading so that there's like a little highlight, I guess, between the shading and the line art. For most of my shading, I do use a hard brush, specifically the technical pen in Procreate, but any hard brush will do. But for a few areas, like the eye and around the muzzle, I use a airbrush to create like a little bit of a gradient. I use gradients fairly sparingly because I think too much and it can look a bit messy, but I quite like the effect you get where you have like a hard edge bit of shading leading into a gradient. I think that can give quite a nice effect, certainly for large areas or like smoother areas. To make gradients in Procreate, because obviously Procreate doesn't actually have like a gradient tool, I take the airbrush and then usually on quite a large setting, and I'm using the soft airbrush by the way, and just lightly sort of paint around the edge of the area that you want the gradient to be, because obviously I start out with quite a hard shaded area, so literally just a little bit on the edge, and then usually you have to take the eraser also set to the soft airbrush and erase a little bit. It can take a little bit of playing around with just because Procreate's not the best for gradients as far as I've found. Once you've finished tidying up the shading, set the shading layer to alpha lock, and then take the soft airbrush again, and I usually use a sort of purple colour or maybe a dark blue, generally purple, and airbrush into areas where the shading would be darker, and then afterwards for areas that would be lighter I usually take, generally it's either a paler pink or a pale blue depending on like the background colour and everything. In this case it was a pale blue, and airbrush the edges of the shading where it would be lighter. Be quite gentle I guess when you're doing this. You don't want to create like really dark or really pale areas. It's just to create a bit of colour variation in the shading. While we're on the subject, never shade in black. Like, don't do that. I think most people know that these days, but don't. Or like grey. Like dark murky colours is generally not a great idea to shade in unless you've got like a super dark picture, because it makes things look dirty rather than shaded. So the next step is to make a new layer above the shading layer you've just done. Set that one to multiply as well and reduce the opacity to roughly what your original shading layer is. So if you've got the shading layer at 40%, set this layer to 40% as well. And choose the same colour that you were originally using to shade in. So here I'm using the same pink that I was using originally. And basically all you do is go round the outside of the shading that you've already done and just outline it all. And in areas that are darker, so for example here, like the bases of the tufts of hair, add like extra little details of like little tufts of hair in that. Yeah, just little details like that. Generally on sort of larger areas like the face where the hair is not fluffy, it's quite like short fur, I wouldn't add much in the way of detail. I would literally just outline the shading I've already done and maybe make bits like above the eye there a bit darker. Once you've gone around all the edges of the shading and added in all the little areas of darker shading, then do the same again as you did with the first layer of shading and set it to alpha lock, and then airbrush in the same colours you used before in similar sorts of places to add some colour variation and to make it match the colour underneath. And then you might need to do a third layer again set to multiply using the same colour, and then outline the second layer of shading in the areas where you did like darker tufts of fur. It's not always necessary, it depends how dark you need the shading to be, but generally I like the look of outlined shading. I think it looks quite nice, so I will outline basically all the shading I do, so it might take a few layers to do that. Next, make 2 new layers on top of the shading. Set one of them to colour burn and one to overlay, and then take usually sort of a dark purple or dark blue on the colour burn layer, airbrush that in the darker areas, and then play with the opacity until it looks not super obvious, but so there's a slight colour change. And on the overlay layer, usually use like a lighter pink or blue, and again airbrush that in the lighter areas, and then reduce the opacity until it looks how you want. I usually have it quite low, about 20%, but generally play around with it until you get the look you're going for. Then it's time to make yet another new layer, but this time leave the layer mode to just normal, and select, it's generally a blue or purple but quite pale. It's best to use a colour that matches the background, so in this case a pale blue, and fill in areas that are further away. So here the lead, which is like behind the dog, I colour that in with the blue colour. As you can see here, I've reduced the opacity. I usually start out with it at full opacity and then fill some in and then reduce the opacity to what I think looks good. So yeah, any areas that are like further away or behind something else. So here, for example, this piece of neck is like behind his ear, so I fill in the area next to that, and then sort of erase it a little bit with the airbrush so it sort of blends in. And yeah, if you haven't already reduced the opacity, reduce the opacity. And I do this, use it fairly sparingly, but you know, any area that you think needs it. It's generally a good way of showing distance, but also making it more obvious, like the difference between different parts of the drawing. So like it's easier to see the difference between his ear and his neck because you've got that little pale sort of bounce lighting thing going on. And any areas that you think would be reflecting like the background colour, add this too. So the next step you could possibly do at the end of the drawing rather than now, and to be honest sometimes I do it at the end, but here I've done it at this point. Make a new layer, again set to normal, using the same colour and quite a large brush size with the airbrush. Just go around the edge of the drawing and sort of airbrush in the colour. It makes it look a little bit softer, which is quite nice. So the final stage isn't really shading as such, I guess, but it is the final thing I do, so I'm going to include it here because I feel it really ties everything together and makes everything look just that little bit better. I guess if you really wanted to, you could skip this step, but personally, I mean, it's my favourite part of drawing, this part. It's literally, I go back over the entire drawing and add highlights and little sort of extra tufts of fur and things like that. This is just on a new layer set to normal. It's not clipped to the colour layer like all the previous shading layers have been. It's just set on top so that you can draw little tufts of fur and things that aren't stuck on the layer of colour you've already done. And it means you can sort of draw over the line art and tidy up things you aren't really happy with. Like, yeah, I draw over the line art quite a lot in this, which I love doing. I feel that's quite a liberating thing to be able to do. Because like when I first started out drawing, like the idea of drawing over the line art, even on a separate layer, was like unimaginable to me. I was like, the line art is the be all and end all. I have to stick within the line art. But now I'm just like, I don't care, I'm just gonna draw over it. So yeah, that's always like a fun part for me. Throughout this, I'm literally just using the technical pen, but any hard brush will do. Usually set to quite a small size. I think about 20 probably, sometimes a little bit larger, sometimes maybe a little bit smaller, but generally about 20. Yeah, and as you can see, I'm just going over everything and adding in little details and sorting out any areas where I think the lines are too thick or I'm not quite happy with how they look to begin with, and doing like highlights. Generally I have like a lighter highlight, sort of the same colour as the background, so blue, and then almost on like the opposite side, so like I've got the blue highlights on the sort of top half of his face and then purple highlights on the bottom, just because I like the kind of contrast, and I think that looks better than having just blue highlights all the way around. And then adding little tufts of fur and things that don't have like proper line art around them. I think it looks better because it just kind of breaks up the line art, so it's not just like lines everywhere. But yeah, so this is always a fun part for me. I mean, I don't go too mad with it. Like, you could do like little highlights on every tuft of fur, but I generally don't do that because, like, try not to like over detail certain areas. Like, you want everything to be a similar level of detail, so don't have one area where you add in loads, because then, well, you can, but then you've got to do it the whole like the whole drawing you have to do that with. So keep it at like a manageable level unless you want to go all out with it. Consistency is always a good thing in art. Don't have one really simple bit and then one really detailed bit. So that is it, folks. That is basically all I do for my shading. Obviously you can add like extra overlay layers or layers set to different colour modes and stuff. It's a good idea to play around with it. And to be honest, generally speaking, it's good to have a bit of flexibility in any method you use for any part of drawing. The method you use isn't necessarily going to work for every drawing you do, but like sometimes I do change up my shading, but this is generally what I do. So if you have a good idea of like what you're doing to begin with, then it does make it easier to like change up certain aspects of what you're doing and change methods and stuff a little bit. Yeah, be flexible in your artwork, as in other aspects of life, I guess. I hope this has been a useful video for some of you. I know it's been a long time coming, so I hope it was worth the wait to some extent. I hope it helps you all with your shading. And if you follow this tutorial for any of your artwork, please like send me a link or tag me or something on social media somewhere, because I'd love to see, like, I like seeing when people take my advice. Yeah, if you have any questions or any sort of feedback, I would love to hear, so feel free to drop a comment. And I hope you're having a great day and staying safe, and I wish you all the best with your artwork and your shading. And yeah, the most important thing, have fun with it. Like, don't, like, shading's quite a big deal. I think people stress about shading, but seriously, have fun with it. Don't stress too much about it. It's fine. You'll get there in the end. It took me a long time to get to this level of shading, to be honest, and I mean, even then it's not like that amazing, but it does take a lot of practice, so just keep at it. You will get there in the end, I promise you. Have a good day, folks. Bye.